But the greatest generation, the heroes of World War II and the New Deal and the civil rights pioneers, were followed by what some have called the silent generation, now in their late 60s and 70s. Though some will tell you they weren't that silent. Many of them populated the newly created suburbs of the 1950s and 1960s, a generation that benefited from the post-war economy, a time when America was riding high, and when neighborhood segregation was being built into those suburban tracts, often with racial covenants included to keep people of color out, a practice that is often cited as having begun in California and certainly was in place in Michigan, particularly in the communities around the city of Detroit. The cultural messages were still messages of exclusion. Then there was my generation, the baby boom generation, or the boomers as we are called. The youngest of us is approaching 50, the oldest is now in their 60s. There are lots of us, and we came of age in the time of the Vietnam War, the social protests of the civil rights movement, and the women's movement. President Lyndon Johnson launched the affirmative action era. In fact, he coined that term, affirmative action, if you're wondering where that came from, with his executive order in 1965, and doors began to open to those who had previously been excluded. And certainly you can see that pattern in colleges and universities beginning to actively recruit Black college students, the same institutions that had excluded them, now beginning to recruit them, et cetera. Generation X, now in their mid to late 30s and early 40s, came of age during the so-called culture wars, which featured the backlash against affirmative action and diversity initiatives, as well as the rapid expansion of technology in all parts of our lives. And then we have what used to be called Generation Y, but now more commonly is referred to as the millennials. There are 70 million of the millennials, born between 1977 and 1994, the largest generation since the baby boomers. This is the generation that was the first to embrace presidential candidate Barack Obama, those who were old enough to vote, and here's why. They are by far the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in US history. 35% are of color, as compared to only 14% in the GI generation. Latinos are the largest group, 16% of the millennials, and African Americans, 14%, making this the first generation in US history in which Blacks are not the largest racial or ethnic group. This generation also has the largest share of second-generation immigrants in 80 years, children of the wave of immigration that began in the mid-1960s. In the year 2000, 14 million were children of immigrants. Given this demographic development, it is not surprising that these young people would reflect a certain comfort with diversity. They are more at ease with difference, at least in the abstract. And I say in the abstract because they and their younger siblings are still experiencing considerable racial and ethnic fragmentation. They are going to school in an era of resegregation. In every part of the country, Blacks and Latinos are more likely to be in segregated schools today than they were in the 1980s. The public policy decisions that ended school busing in many communities led to a return to neighborhood schools where the segregated housing patterns established in the 1950s persist, and consequently result in the perpetuation of school segregation. Ironically, for this generation, it's often in private schools that the opportunity still exists to create a more inclusive school community, because unlike public schools, the population in private schools has become more diverse rather than less so. But those of you who have seen demographic changes in your children's school, whether private or public, know that it's not just about the numbers. I wrote in my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and Other Conversations About Race, in 1996. And still, 14, 15 years later, many people are still asking this question. In some schools, there are genuine concerns about social fragmentation among groups of students, as the question suggests. In others, there may be concerns about racial gaps in achievement, or both. How do we build one strong school community, one where every child is supported to achieve his or her personal best? just as we want to build one U.S. community where each of us has a chance to be at our best. The challenge to doing so is real, and I'm going to lay out 3 strategies for moving in that direction, but I want to just pause here to emphasize the urgency of doing so. With our population increasingly diverse, as you've heard, with the diversity that is in the millennial generation, 35% young people of color, with the fact that demographers tell us by 2045 we will be a nation that is majority minority. That is a crazy sentence. Let me say that again. That the majority of our population by 2045 will indeed be people of color. And recognizing that if we do not create a society that takes full advantage of the talent potential of all of our citizens, we will be out of luck as a nation. That much is very clear. If you've read Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, one of the things he talks about is the rise of competition around the world. The technological revolution that has happened means that anyone with access to the internet can be a competitive force in the world of business and the global economy, and that it is really education and innovation that will allow the U.S. to maintain its position of economic prominence. But that opportunity for economic development depends on investing in the population at hand. And if we write off as not worth investing in the population of color, we are eliminating, by 2045, more than half of our population. And that will lead to certain demise as a nation. So we need to understand that recognizing the ways in which historic patterns of racism and assumptions about who has talent and who does not make a difference in terms of the decisions and public policy practices we engage in, and if we are not conscious of those underlying assumptions and the impact that they have long term, we will find ourselves in a very difficult position, even more difficult than we find ourselves in today. So how do we do this? How do we build one strong community? How do we engage one another in a way that allows for the development of everyone's full potential? My answer to this question lies in these easy to remember but not so simple to do ABCs. A stands for affirming identity. B stands for building community. C stands for cultivating leadership. So let me talk about the A. And I will share with you that a lot of my work around issues of race have been done in the context of working with teachers in schools. And when I talk with teachers in schools, one of the things I talk about is that students need to see themselves reflected, all students need to see themselves reflected in the environment around them, in the curriculum, in the faculty, in the staff, and the faces of their classmates, to avoid feelings of invisibility or marginality that can undermine student success. But the same is true in our workplaces, in our community organizations. Everyone wants to see themselves as part of the fabric of our environment, included in ways that bring about a sense of pride and belonging. The importance of this experience is easily understood when we consider the following example. Imagine that there is a photographer on this stage with me, with a wide-angle lens wide enough to capture everyone in the room. And at the end of my talk, through the speed of digital photography, you are able to get a copy of this photograph when you leave. What is the first thing you are going to do when you get your copy of the picture? You're going to look for yourself. That is the only answer, my friends, to this question. You are not saying, I'm looking for Chuck Green, unless you are Chuck Green. No offense, Chuck. No, you're not saying, I'm looking for Beverly Tatum. You might look for me eventually, but first you're going to look for yourself, right? You're going to look for yourself in the picture. We all do this, and we would be disappointed if for some reason our smiling face was missing from that group shot.